So antimicrobials are, like PFAS, a chemical that seems good and seems to have a useful function. But the question is, does it really? And often we found that PFAS had no function or little function, particularly given the potential for harm, which we've been learning more and more about. So antimicrobials, for example, in hand soap, actually don't provide a benefit. Both the Center for Disease Control and the FDA say it's much better to wash with plain soap and water. Believe it or not, soap and water washes away all the germs, bodily fluids, every gross thing you can imagine. Soap and water is the best. And antimicrobials actually are not better. In fact, in some cases, they're worse because they can be sticky, while soap and water makes everything clean and cleans away all the problems. Antimicrobials have been shown to cause a wide range of health harms, different antimicrobials, but allergies, asthma. They kill bacteria, so they're highly toxic to the little creatures in the creek.
I'm Meg Carney, an outdoor and environmental journalist, and this is the Outdoor Minimalist podcast. Thank you for joining us so that together we can create a better outdoor space as we recreate. What if the same determination it takes to climb some of the world's highest peaks was also the key to tackling some of the world's biggest chemical threats? That's the story of today's guest, Arlene Blum, a pioneering mountaineer who led the first women's ascent of Denali and led the first American ascent of Annapurna I. Arlene later turned her focus toward another steep climb, protecting the public from harmful chemicals. As the founder of the Green Science Policy Institute, she has helped phase out toxic flame retardants and raised global awareness of PFAS, also known as forever chemicals. And you may remember her from our Forever Chemicals podcast series last year. Now, Arlene is sounding the alarm on what could be the next PFAS, antimicrobials. And as we celebrate 200 episodes here on the Outdoor Minimalist podcast, we are excited to explore the parallels between adventure and advocacy, and how we can carry the many lessons we learn in the wilderness into creating change within our own communities. Thank you so much for joining us on the Outdoor Minimalist podcast. If listeners are familiar with the Forever Chemicals podcast, then they may recognize today's guests. So, Arlene, you've described mountaineering and scientific advocacy as having some very specific parallel challenges, which I think is really interesting, especially for our listenership. So can you share a little bit about some of your early expeditions and how they prepared you in your current career and kind of like a lifelong mission of battling chemical policy reform?
Yeah, and I'd like to call it more healing the world and making things better. And I think it's part of the same process. So back when I learned to climb at Reed College, it was great. Lots of the climbers were women and there was no problem. But when I started going on expeditions, I discovered that women often weren't included. And back when I wanted to climb Denali, I was told women could come along as far as base camp to help with the cooking at a reduced price. And so I just thought, I wonder if a team of all women could climb Denali. And that seemed like a pretty revolutionary idea. This was back in 1970, half a century ago. And I found 5 other women, and we climbed Denali. And indeed, I was the co-leader, but our real leader was a very experienced Alaskan woman climber who was not good at altitude, which she had neglected to tell us, and who collapsed unconscious just below the summit. And so I was 25, and I ended up rescuing an unconscious person from below the summit of Denali, which really increased my confidence that I could do challenging things. I actually grew up with not too much confidence, but climbing can really help. So I continued climbing with men and women. And then again, I was told women couldn't climb to 8,000 meters. And so I organized a team of women to attempt Annapurna I, which didn't have much history in those days. And we thought, well, it's one of the less high 8,000 meter peaks. And it was the first one ever climbed in 1950. So maybe it'll be one of the easiest. As you and your listeners might know, Annapurna I turns out to probably be the most dangerous and maybe the most difficult of the 8,000-meter peaks. And we did climb it. It's the first women's ascent and the first American ascent. And I guess I've done a number of other first ascent expeditions in India and Nepal, and once I wanted to see the whole Himalayas, and I get motion sick in cars. And, to do expeditions in India, you have to go up these curvy roads, which was miserable. And I thought, well, if I walked from one end of the Himalayas to the other, I could see the whole thing without getting motion sick. So I spent a year walking across Bhutan, Sikkim, Nepal, and India. And I think what I've learned very late in life, like now, is kind of my gift is having a vision of something that makes the world better, giving women a chance to climb high mountains, and then just being very determined to find others to share my vision and to make it a reality. And so in my scientific work, I feel like I'm doing the same kind of thing. So it actually started, my scientific work started back in the mid-70s when I was climbing an easy 23,000-foot peak in India with Bruce Carson, who was then America's leading young rock climber. He actually pioneered climbing grade 6s in Yosemite without pitons using chalks. And he persuaded people like Yvon Chouinard and Royal Robbins that this was possible and led them up these grade 6s. And that, I heard, led to the beginning of Patagonia and Royal Robbins. So he was an amazing visionary climber. We were climbing an easy 7,000-meter peak with a big cornice on the summit, and he stepped through the cornice and fell to his death. And he was 24 years old. Horrible. And I was really depressed, and I wanted to do something in his memory for the environment, because he was a very strong early environmentalist. And I learned that there were these flame retardants in kids' pajamas that looked really harmful, and the chemicals were like 10% of the weight of the pajamas. And they probably got into the children. And we did an experiment, and we found a little girl whose mom had bought her pajamas in the UK. So she hadn't had the flame retardant pajamas like American kids did. And we put her in the American pajamas, collected her urine. And the first day there were cancer-causing breakdown products in her urine. So that meant that the chemicals went from the pajamas into the little girl. And in America, chemicals that we eat, like foods, drugs, pesticides, are regulated. We may argue about how well, but they are regulated. But things, at least then, in pajamas and furniture and consumer products, really weren't. Anyway, so we discovered that it was a very strong mutagen, a carcinogen, and in those days we published our paper, a lead article in Science, and the next week we're on the 3 morning shows, Good Morning America, The Today Show, and every parent in America knew. And 3 months later, the chemicals in pajamas were banned. And that's the value, by the way, of a unified media, where everybody in America hears the same messages and things can really happen. So that's how my career started in working on harmful chemicals. And I think what I found is both in expeditionary climbing, working on chemicals, you start with a vision, being at kids' pajamas without cancer-causing chemicals, or a team of women getting to the top of an 8,000-meter peak. And then you find others who share your vision, other climbers, other scientists. Then you have to raise money, resources, get equipment, pack heavy loads. And in all these things, trudge up the mountain. It sounds glamorous, but really, like what I do, what you all do, it's hard work. And along the way, there may be avalanches and blizzards, and occasional Yeti will pop out, but you just have to keep persevering. So that's my analogy. And after years of climbing and hiking, my knees aren't so good for climbing mountains now, but I get very similar satisfactions, and indeed think it's more important making the world healthier. Long
Yeah.
answer.
A perfect answer. No, I love that analogy because I think it's very relatable. And I think when you have something that feels a little more abstract, like chemical regulations or something like that, putting it more into the physical makes it easier to understand kind of like how you can accomplish those things. And much of what you have just told us, is that predominantly what's covered in your new book, Breaking Trail, or do you kind of like delve into other areas of your life and lessons that have transferred from climbing into your environmental work?
Well, Breaking Trail took a long time to write. I wrote my first book, Annapurna A Woman's Place, about the 1978 Annapurna climb in a year. And then a friend said, you should write about your life and how you got to Annapurna. And I thought, oh, that will take another year. And it actually took me 20 years because it's a really personal book of understanding. I had a very challenging childhood and understanding how the challenges of my childhood led to whoever I am now. Like I grew up in a house that was really small and full of cigarette smoke, loud TV, and people arguing. And I was in Chicago, and I would love in the winter just to run out in the snow and shovel snow. And the colder and the more blizzardy it was, the better I liked it compared to my smoky, noisy house. And so I've always loved being outdoors in blizzards, which some people think is unusual, but I could trace it back. So anyway, so I kind of did a lot of tracing back to my childhood. So it's a very personal book. And I also was doing science at the time. So I wanted to call the book Mountains and Molecules, and the publishers thought molecules wouldn't sell. So it was called Breaking Trail, but it's Breaking Trail in mountaineering and in science is how I like to think about it.
Yeah, and one of those things that you've done to break trail, especially in science, is the Green Science Policy Institute. And that's something that hopefully people are familiar with because you've done a lot of great work. And your role with phasing out harmful flame retardants and raising awareness around PFAS or forever chemicals is amazing. But what strategies in those processes and like the years of work you've done have proven to be the most effective, you think, in terms of actually driving change?
Well, good question. And I will say I just feel so privileged to have found, I didn't start this till I was about retirement age. And so I was so happy to have found a way, to take the mountaineering skills when I really couldn't climb high mountains to doing things to make the world better. And what we do is we find a problem. And then we, as scientists, we usually collaborate with other scientists to investigate it further, write peer-reviewed papers, and then really publicize our papers a lot. Then we try to become an alternative. We work with whoever can solve the problem, and it's usually either business or government or both. And so we often the information business gets about their chemicals is not really accurate. And so we like to be a source of alternative information to business and their partners. So we're not an NGO that, blames and shames, but we're an NGO who educates and helps industry business to manufacturers to move in a better direction. And I've been really amazed how well that can work. If you want, I can give you a favorite example and then tell you of an upcoming adventure. But the favorite example is when we started working on PFAS, which are very problematic stain and water repellent chemicals. We read some articles that the largest source of exposure for young children was carpeting, because they crawl on the carpets, they put their hands in their mouths. And the carpet industry are all based in Dalton, Georgia. And so we actually invited them to come to Berkeley for a one-day meeting. And why did they come? Because we collaborate with some of their big customers. We have a buyers club with Google and Genentech and Harvard, and who buy lots of carpet and want carpet without PFAS. So they have a healthy environment for their workers and the public. But in those days at Home Depot or Lowe's, what you got was PFAS carpet because that was what people thought they wanted. So anyway, the big customers invited the carpet industry. They all came to the David Brower Center in Berkeley and walked in saying, well, we used to have this long chain C8 on our carpets, and we were told that's not so good. So now we have a safer alternative, the short chain C6, and we've solved the problem, and why are you bothering us? And then a bunch of scientists who they knew and respected because we'd actually started our meeting with a big Italian dinner with lots of wine. So all became good friends. So their friends, the scientists, said, well, actually, the chemicals you're using, the C6, are just as bad or maybe worse than the old ones because there are more of them. They're harder to get out of water. So you haven't solved the problem. And then some of their customers came in and said, yeah, we don't want, like, Google, we don't want them in our buildings, and Kaiser Permanente, we don't want them in our hospitals. Harvard, we don't want our students exposed. They're big customers. And then there were people in the room, like from the California Department of Toxic Substances, saying, well, we're going to be regulating carpets. It'll take us a few years. And unbelievably, at the end of one day, they all decided to stop using PFAS in carpets. And they did. And it took them 2 years. And by 2020, Home Depot and Lowe's were advertising all their carpets were PFAS free. And the regulation didn't come till 2022. And that is so good when industry can see the writing on the wall, when they can get good information that they really are harming their workers and the public. I don't think anybody wants to do that. So we like to put the case together, share it with the industry, and have them decide that they want to do something else. That's the best way to do it. Now, the outdoor industry, I started in 2013 saying, can I talk to you about PFAS? And they would not talk to me. I used to talk at outdoor retailers. I got blackballed. Nobody wanted me publicly to say PFAS was a problem. And so we kept trying to invite them to come to the David Brower Center for a meeting to learn about PFAS, but nobody really wanted to come until I think it was September of 2022, California banned PFAS in textiles. And then they all came in November and we all talked about what they could do to get PFAS out. And it was by the beginning of 2025. And I think they all have it out and they still have good functional products. So in that case, they really wanted a level playing field and they needed government action. The people in the room couldn't or wouldn't want to make that. They didn't want to get in the room to talk about it, because they felt they needed it for performance, even though a number of companies in Europe actually got out of it quite a while ago. But in any case, so those are kind of the two extremes. And we're going to have a meeting. Antimicrobials are what we're working on now. We're going to have a meeting with people who use antimicrobials in their products, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah, I think those are such great examples of how industry can push back in different ways, but also how collaborative conversations, like you're saying you've had, can be so beneficial because once they understand this and hopefully can see that this is an issue, they can shift early on. But yes, the outdoor industry did kind of drop the ball on that one. And hopefully they learned from that experience. But you mentioned antimicrobials, and you've said in the past that antimicrobials are kind of maybe going to be the new PFAS. And so for listeners that maybe aren't following what do you call it? It's like the six.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. One of our ideas that I think has been super helpful is thinking about chemicals in families or classes. Because there's a big tendency, we all heard about BPA in water bottles, big campaigns, and all the water bottles say BPA free, but the substitute is often something like BPS, which is very similar in structure and function, and not much is known yet about the toxicity, but guess what? If it's similar in structure and function, what do you think? The toxicity. And I think you could go through BP A to Z and still find that. So let's just not put BP A to Z in our products. PFAS is an extreme example because there's thousands of PFAS. And again, it takes years of scientific research and advocacy to regulate a single chemical. And it's expensive for manufacturers to change processes. So if the chemical industry says, well, maybe there was a problem with, the long chain PFAS, but we've got the short chain PFAS, and they're great. And we really haven't studied them yet, but we're sure they're great. Well, they turn out not to be great. And then that's kind of expensive for the manufacturer to have to keep changing. So we think, we're not saying a whole class shouldn't be used, but if a lot of members of a class are harmful, then you should look with some concern before you switch to something that's almost identical.
Yeah, and so within those classes, there's like 6 different classes of chemicals you guys have kind of categorized. And you've mentioned a few of them, but antimicrobials is one that I definitely want to learn a little bit more about. So, what parallels do you see with antimicrobials in general within these classes of chemicals in how they are kind of being used and regulated?
Okay, I'm going to just do one more digression and just encourage your listeners, if they want to go to sixclasses.org, where they can watch a 4-minute video on each of those 6 classes, learn where the chemicals are used, why they're harmful, and how they can reduce their exposure. So learning that can really help people in half an hour, 6 classes. So antimicrobials are, like PFAS, a chemical that seems good and it seems to have a useful function. But the question is, does it really? And often we found that PFAS had no function or little function, particularly given the potential for harm, which we've been learning more and more about. So antimicrobials, for example, in hand soap, actually don't provide a benefit. Both the Center for Disease Control and the FDA say it's much better to wash with plain soap and water. Believe it or not, soap and water washes away all the germs, bodily fluids, every gross thing you can imagine. Soap and water is the best. And antimicrobials actually are not better. In fact, in some cases, they're worse because they can be sticky, while soap and water makes everything clean and cleans away all the problems. Antimicrobials have been shown to cause a wide range of health harms, different antimicrobials, but allergies, asthma. They kill bacteria, so they're highly toxic to the little creatures in the creek. So say you wash your hands with antimicrobial soap for 20 seconds. Well, the antimicrobial says on the label, for it to be effective, leave it on for 2 minutes or 3 minutes. Nobody does that. Maybe surgeons do it. Maybe surgeons need it, but people wash it for 20 seconds, doesn't do anything for your hands, goes out into the wash water and kills little creatures in the creek. And in some cases comes back in women's breast milk. There was a very bad antimicrobial called triclosan that was banned in 2015, but had been used for years and was found in virtually all American women's breast milk, even though it had not done anything for hand washing. So another problem is our sewage treatment plants work with bacteria digesting the sewage. So you get lots of antimicrobials in your sewage treatment plant. And guess what? It might stop working, which is not a good thing. Even worse, antimicrobial resistance is a global problem. Thousands of people die, they're in a hospital, and suddenly they're resistant to all the antibiotics. And we know one problem is antibiotics in animal food, but a second problem is the overuse of antimicrobials, which can also encourage that. So you only want to use antimicrobials as directed, when you know they're going to work. And I have to say, I go to, because my knees are kind of a problem, I've discovered I go to the Y and I use the knee machines, and it really helps my knees. But everybody in the Y is spraying every machine before and after they use them. And a lot of the sprays are quaternary ammonium compounds, which are quite harmful. And again, to be used properly, are supposed to be left on wet for minutes and then wiped off. And people should be wearing protective gear when they spray them, because the spray is dangerous. And here at the gym, people are just spraying them a lot, then wiping it with their towel, then wiping their towel with their forehead, and being exposed. And there's no benefit if you just spray and wipe. So, for example, in gyms, we think that if people want to clean between users, they should use soap and water, or something that's not toxic, alcohol. And if you really want to be disinfection with an antimicrobial, it should be done properly by gym personnel when nobody's there and they're wearing protective gear. So this is a similar case of something you're hoping for something good, but you're really ending up with health harm. And in this case, it's to the people who are being exposed to the environment, because remember, they kill bacteria, they kill a lot of things. To wastewater treatment and to antibacterial resistance. So there are a lot of problems, little benefit in most uses, and this is not well known. So everybody believes the right thing to do is lots of antibacterials, because since the pandemic, even though most diseases are air transmit, not surface transmit. So spraying all those surfaces isn't actually going to help you. So my little tirade.
Yeah, I know. Antimicrobials are so interesting. I was also going to bring up the pandemic of like, I feel like everyone was sanitizing everything all of the time. And then we've kind of carried a lot of those habits past that pandemic time, like always using hand sanitizers, always wiping down your surfaces with these antimicrobials. I mean, how do you think you can kind of break through so many people believing it's a good thing and believing that it's helping them and showing them that there are safer and better alternatives that are not as harmful to us or the planet?
Well, first, we're talking to you and telling you and your audience. So we're getting started. And it really is changing how people think. And that is a big order because the people selling them do a lot of advertising. In fact, we're collecting the most outrageous ads to share with some late night people to see if we can use a little comedy. If you've ever heard of miracle sheets, which will protect you from baldness and better sleep. And what are they? They're sheets plus nano silver. And I don't want to sleep on nano silver, but mostly it goes out in the wash water and highly ecotoxic. So it's the miracle is unfortunately what happens to the environment from miracle sheets. And there's a lot of that advertising. So I don't know, but you're in communication. I should ask you, how do we get the word out? Because that's really what needs to happen. I think when people know about it, they make other choices. But as you said, particularly since the pandemic, everybody believes it's really a good thing to spray away with antimicrobials, irrespective of whether we know if there's a benefit and there might be a harm.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different ways. I love the like comedy approach. I think that's very relatable to a lot of people and often reaches a wider audience. But yeah, podcasts are also a great way. So we're glad that you're here. And you mentioned a couple of alternatives or like one main alternative just being plain soap and water. So do you think that's the primary alternative people should gravitate towards, or are there others that are also readily available?
Oh, citric acid is relatively harmless. It's okay. Alcohol, in certain cases, hydrogen peroxide, except you don't want to breathe it. So you don't want to spray it. Yeah, the EPA has what they call safer choice, where they certify certain products as being okay. Um, and it depends what the use. Sometimes you do need a disinfectant, but then you want to use one that's the least harmful. And read the directions. Like all these quats say, don't put them, children should not be exposed. They're considered pesticides by the EPA, but yet the back to school template for what kids should bring back to school contains Clorox disinfectant wipes, which contain quats, which children aren't supposed to be exposed to. And one question they say, well, they're for the teacher to use. But, a friend said her kindergarten daughter is wiping her table with the disinfectant quats. And I'm sure that's happening all over the country because that's the sort of template back to school list that schools get. And they can change it, but the one they start with has Clorox wipes. And Clorox actually helps sponsor the website. But they also have non-antibacterial wipes, and they could switch to putting those in the back to school. Just like for babies, there's both kinds, and I know which kind I would recommend. So if people get alerted to the fact that that there's no reason to select a product that contains an antibacterial when they can just have the plain product without it.
Yeah, with so many alternatives already being available, I feel like it is a little bit easier to just make a better choice once you already are aware that it could be a problem, especially around children. And so, if antimicrobials are indeed potentially the next PFAS, what do you think in terms of industry and policy? What would success kind of look like to you and your team?
Well, getting, as we said, getting people to recognize that you don't want antibacterials. I mean, I think when we started working on flame retardants, all the scientists would give their papers and they say, flame retardants are essential for fire safety, but they harm everything. And then they discovered that they actually didn't provide fire safety. So they stopped saying that. And people who are knowledgeable know that they often, the way they're used, they often don't. So I think the first thing is a general awareness that when used properly, like a disinfectant, when you need to disinfect, following directions can be useful. I'm not saying the whole thing isn't, but the way they're usually used, like spraying them widely in the gyms, which we're doing all over the country, all these gyms we had a summer student who went to 20 local gyms, and over half of them were using these quaternary ammonium compounds as sprays. So success would be, I think, if the companies who made them recognized that they could still have good products and move to safer alternatives. And so they can't do plain soap and water because you don't make a profit, but they can put citric acid and a preservative in it and call it something green clean and still make a profit, whatever they need to do. So, I mean, we do think working with the manufacturers and educating them to better choices. Government regulation is tough. I think federal regulation right now is pretty off the table. I mean, it has been for quite a while. The states have taken the lead on things like PFAS, and now I don't know what's going to happen, attempts from the federal government, to preempt the states, which would be very unfortunate, I think. So anyway, regulation is hard and slow. So it is better if manufacturers and businesses make better choices around their products. And I think it's hard for consumers to distinguish. We don't have the time to read all those little words on the label. On the other hand, there are soaps like Dawn dish soap, which everybody loves, the nice blue Dawn, that they wash the birds after. So at Safeway, there's a row of nice blue Dawn that everyone loves. And below that is antibacterial Dawn, which is pink and orange, apple and lemon or whatever. And if you read the label very carefully, it says chloroxylenol antibacterial hand soap. And that's because they have put in a harmful antimicrobial, and it's not allowed in dish soap, but there's this thing where it is allowed in hand soap. So it's labeled as hand soap. Very strange. And I think that's not good for their brand. People really like that. But if people started reading the little print on the label, they might start questioning it. So I kind of think it's in industry's best interest to get ahead of consumers and just move to healthier products. So anyway, long answer, but I think that would be very helpful for the companies and the world if they could move away from some of these harmful antimicrobials to safer solutions.
Yeah. And I mean, I love to see industry kind of like leading the charge on some of these topics, especially moving away from harmful chemicals. I also think that consumers do have a lot of power in terms of where they're spending their money and what they're asking for from companies. I guess Disney and Jimmy Kimmel would be a recent example that we saw of that. A lot of consumer pressure played into their role of like reinstating him. So, how do you think consumers can help push for better regulations around things like antimicrobials or really any of those 6 classes of chemicals?
Well, I guess they have to read the labels, but it's pretty easy to because usually it says in pretty big letters antibacterial or antimicrobial. So that's to be avoided. And just to say hand sanitizer is usually fine. It's usually just alcohol and aloe vera. So it doesn't say antibacterial. If it says antibacterial, it's a problem, but there's a very small amount that does. So that's actually a pretty simple one. If people recognize that the antibacterials can be health harmful and don't provide a benefit and just don't buy them. But getting that word out, without an advertising budget, because there's a lot of advertising, outrageous advertising that, it favoring them. I think consumers, but it's just a lot of work with so many products to get educated and make better choices. But there are consumers who want to do that. And that I did recommend watching our 6 classes videos to get some starts on how to do that.
Yeah, if there are other resources, if people want to learn more about antimicrobials or any other chemicals that could be in their products, I know the Green Science Policy Institute, you have a lot of resources on your website. So what would be some of the primary ones you'd point people to?
Well, we do, right. If you go to greensciencepolicy.org, EWG has a good website listing products. I think nowadays, if you Google or go to AI, you can actually get good information. If you're looking sunscreen, for example, of many, many resources. Consumer Reports has great information. The New York Times Wirecutter often will have good information. So, but it's a lot of work for all the things you buy to do that. So it's much better if the manufacturers take on the burden rather than the consumers trying to shop their way out of these things.
Absolutely. Well, Arlene, thank you so much for your time and for sharing this important message. I think everyone should definitely head to the Green Science Policy Institute website, and I subscribe to your newsletter. I think there's a ton of great content in there. And check out Arlene's book, Breaking Trail. I'm looking forward to reading it. I haven't read it yet, but I think your journey and your story through the mountains and also science is very inspiring. So, do you have anything else that you want to add?
Well, just thank you. And I was inspired by the really good job you did on your story on PFAS, and maybe you'll do a similar story on antimicrobials. I would be delighted.
Maybe.
Thanks for listening. And if you like what you hear, let me know. Leave a review and be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. You can find us on Instagram at outdoor.minimalist.book, on YouTube, or subscribe to our weekly newsletter at theoutdoorminimalist.com. For even more updates, other educational resources, and to help build an outdoor community with the shared goal to create a better outdoor space as we recreate.